we've got Manus Crowley on the right. Some of you were out with him this morning. He's actually Home Trees forester, looks after all of our applications and stuff like that. He's an ecologist actually by trade, isn't that right, Manus? Who went back and did forestry, yeah. Olive Levy is a forest owner, as I said, from County Westmeath, and James Ham, also a forest owner for County Westmeath. So what I really want to do today is just hear their points of view on, I suppose, the challenges, but also the, I know both of you in particular speak about how much you enjoy being in and owning a forest and managing it. I think I selected them for this because they're really passionate forest owners, and I have just one or two pictures of, that's not one, of their woodlands. But maybe just to give a small bit of context before we begin on farm forests, up to around 1990, the Irish state managed afforestation, that's creating new forests. It would have purchased land and planted forests, but the model changed around that time, where instead of the state acquiring land, what the state attempted to do was incentivize private landowners, generally farmers, to create forests on their own land. And that's still the system now. Now, in the early days, there was huge success. You know, there was years they were planting 20,000 hectares a year. I think the current target is around 8,000 hectares a year. But in the last 6 or 8 years, there's been a kind of a steady decline. In the last 2 or 3 in particular, it seems to have kind of gone off a cliff. So the state is really depending on farmers or landowners, private landowners, to create woodlands. And yeah, there's a kind of, I suppose, there's a crisis of confidence in farm forestry. So yeah, like what I'm kind of hoping to get out of today is maybe to understand some of where the challenges are, but also the opportunities. James, I might start with you. This is James' forest. Now that's taken from a drone, so it might not make too much sense to you, but no better man than James. Maybe James, if you just tell us kind of how you got into forestry in the start, what you created on your farm, and your general thoughts, just 5 or 6 minutes maybe. James, I should also say, is a second or third generation hedge layer. You can see in his lovely forest, he's protected his hedges very well. He's a passionate man about hedgerow conservation. So,
thanks, Ray. As I said to Manus on the way in the door, I asked a great philosophical question: why am I here? Look, I was sort of surprised to be asked, but myself and Ray had a great chat on the day he was out on the phone before that. So anyway, to start from the beginning, I'm a farmer. I inherited the family farm. We have 52 hectares. It's good quality Westmeath land, reasonable field size. Traditionally it carried beef cattle, sheep, and some of it is suitable for arable, and we continue with the arable. We are now in a suckler herd. At this stage, 50% of the farm is under trees of various sorts. Quite a lot of conifer because of the soil type didn't all suit broadleaves, but we put in as much broadleaf as possible. To go back a bit before me, my father was always interested in trees and preserved any trees that were on the farm. It wasn't a question of every tree was cut. Trees were cut for various reasons, but for fuel. And going back the years, I remember him cutting trees for a local sawmill to process into timber for a shed door and things like that. So there was a sort of a tradition, if only tenuous, on our farm, which went back as far as that. My father, as Ray pointed out, had been carrying on the tradition of hedge laying, which I have continued from him. And all the hedges, if we want to start as a basis of where I came to trees, it started with the hedges. So the hedges on the farm are mixed species hedges. Some of them are quite old. A lot of them, all of them, are on the 1836 Ordnance Survey. So obviously they're older than that, so they're in excess of 200 years. The diversity in those hedges is probably where the basis of my love of trees came from, because we had everything. Obviously we had the ash with the hawthorn, blackthorn, the lower shrubby species like spindle and that, but we also have English elm. We have one wych elm. The English elm succumbed back in the 70s to the Dutch elm disease, but has kept coming back from suckers again, and that's always interesting to watch. And then of course we had the usual sycamore, beech, and anything else that, is there anything else unusual there? No, you see, when I start talking about trees and what's on my farm, it's funny, I begin to realise that a lot of what's there, I take it as pretty much, that's what I have. And they're all important in their own right, and they're all important as part of the farm structure. And the hedge system, because of the way it was maintained traditionally under coppice and hedge laying, retained its quality as linear woodland. So the linear woodland aspect contributed to a woodland presence on the farm all the time. Now, what happened then was, I mean, down the years, my father said, I'd love to plant a block of trees, and he never got around to it for various reasons. The lower part of the farm was a lot more difficult to work as regards arable and livestock than the upper part. Some of it was a bit low-lying and was inclined to be wet, but it had been, various attempts had been tried to improve it, going back literally 200 years, because when we were trying to improve it in our time, we found evidence of older drainage systems that were there. So it wasn't in its original condition, and it was still becoming harder to manage. So back in 1995, 94, when I was at the height of my having come back from agricultural training, and I was going to change the world agriculturally, and I was trying to better nature on the farm and discovering that it didn't work like that. I came to a stand one day when we were trying to re-drain a field that had been attempted to be drained on several other occasions. We ended up with a plot of ground which was going to require 2 different bridges to access it if we had just gone the normal route of plough, till, reseed and get it into grassland and keep livestock. And I, for some reason or other, I stood in the field one day and I looked at this corner of almost 2 acres, it's 0.87 of a hectare, and I looked at it and I said, wait now, why the hell would I build 2 bridges? Dad always wanted to plant trees. There's the start of why can't we plant trees here? And I thought about it for about 2 hours. End of story. That was it. We were going to finish tidying up the rest of the field and we were going to plant trees in this. And that's what I went to do. So that was the start of my planting a substantial number of trees in any particular area on the farm. I wanted to plant broadleaves. And this is where my trying to be level in talking about bureaucracy comes a bit unstuck. Because I got into, at the time there wasn't a forestation scheme there, and obviously in context of farming you need to bring in money as much as you need to do all the nice things, and I thought, well, if I can do what I want in planting trees and also generate a few bob out of it, brilliant. So I contacted the local Forest Service inspector who came out and insisted that it wasn't going to grow anything except Sitka spruce. And I says, no, I don't want to sow Sitka spruce, I want to sow broadleaves. And he says, no, it'll only grow Sitka spruce. And this went on for about an hour, and he went away, and I said, and I went and I bought 1,000 oak trees.
Just what year was this, James?
95. I went and I bought 1,000 oak trees. I ripped the piece of ground with a tractor, subsoiler, mold plough. And I got a friend of mine to help me, and we planted the 1,000, and we went by no standards in any book. We planted them on 2 metre squares, so 2 metre in the row and 2 metres apart. And then 2 days later I discovered what hares do to line of oak trees. So we had to come in a rush that next day then and put up fencing. And those oak trees are there and they're flying. This is the piece of ground the Sitka spruce would only grow in and no oak would grow in. So because it was outside of the scheme, I've sort of done it. Now I subsequently discovered that I was actually in breach of the legislation by planting more than 0.1 of a hectare.
Not that.
Anyway, it's still there. The oak trees are doing quite well. We messed around with it a bit. We interplanted. There was gaps obviously with the 2 metre spacings, and I bought a bag of this and there was some alder put in. We put in an understory of each about 10 years ago, and that's actually doing quite well, but it's proven that I need to thin the oak more and things like that. So anyway, that was our trial project, and that was where I learned so much in a short space of time about practicalities of growing trees. What happened then was we continued on, and as we began to maybe realise that the modern model of farming that's been taught to me and so many others and sort of voices on it has a lot of flaws in it. I began to realise there's a lot better things to be doing with my land than forcing it all the time to grow grass for livestock that are creating a lot of different issues for me and for, not necessarily making me a bottom line. So in 2005 we went into the forestation scheme proper, and we planted 6.8 hectares of the land with mixed species. So there's some Norway spruce in it, there's larch, there's an oak and pine mix, which is great crack, and there's some alder. And then, because there was an esker running through the site, a small esker,
Can you see it there?
I wanted to plant the shoulders of that with hazel. And that led to an interesting discussion with two different people. Now, one of them was my forester, who was a very good guy and would be very open to the discussion. But because this wasn't happening, why would you want to be planting hazel? And one other guy said it to me as well. Why would you want to be planting hazel? I said, it's more natural on the shoulders of an esker, and it leads to a different type of biodiversity, and it leads to a different type of product coming out of the woods, and I want to go coppice. So we did that, and that became part of the woodland, and then in 2014 we continued and we planted more. So we ended up now with literally 60% or 50% of the farm, 60 acres is under forestry of various types. Now in the latter plantation we put in more Norway spruce, Douglas fir, larch, sycamore. What else is down there, you that knows? And stuff.
Cedar.
The western red cedar went in. We were very lucky at the time that we had quite an open-minded forest inspector dealing with us at that stage. He's gone to higher things since and left us in the lurch badly. But because we needed to keep the stocking rate up in the first 5 years of the plantation, that required the planting in of the gaps, that failures in the crop, and especially in the conifers and the Norway spruce. And I approached him one day. I actually rang him on the phone one day. That was how approachable he was, and I said to him, look, I'm going to need to infill this Norway spruce, but I don't want to put Norway spruce into it. Can I put in stuff like western red cedar into it? And he says, well, the percentages aren't going to be high. Go ahead and do it. Why not? So we've ended up with more diversity in the Norway spruce. We've ended up with more diversity in general. And to just put the lid on the whole issue, that feeds in brilliantly into the fact that from day one we started out adopting the principles of continuous cover forestry. Back in 1995, when I planted those 1,000 oak trees, one of the first things I said was there'll never be clear fell on our farm. So every time we've planted trees since, it's been coming in, and the continuous cover management has been the aim all the way through. Just to deal with this photo here, you probably want me to shut up now in a minute, but
Coming close to it.
Not beyond that point.
Tough. You started and I finished. Just something I'm just very keen to point out, because a major problem that crops up in all afforestation sites nowadays is where we have a bulk of conifer gone in. Now that's mostly Norway there. That's alder, that's larch, that's Norway there. That's oak and pine over there. But because you have the esker running through here and you have the remnants of old hedges, in a lot of forestry sites, those old hedges are being subsumed and shaded out by the new forestry and killed off. And you can see here, now this was, what date was that?
It's 2 months ago. Yeah, well,
No,
yeah,
it's
2
not
months
that
ago. Yeah, I don't know.
It was, no, I'll tell you when it was. It was the 16th of May, that's when it was. The week after May. You can see that the whitethorn was in full bloom. Now that is an old whitethorn hedge. It's quite tall. It's gone. There's no evidence of either laying or coppicing in it at the base. It's just a line of hawthorn trees now at this stage. But what we're keen to do is preserve that for a number of reasons. Firstly, it's a useful piece of diverse tree biodiversity in the middle of all this. The other thing is, because it's so old, the genetics of those old whitethorns has to be better than what we're importing from the continent nowadays, and there's a big gap in the industry there for where we're buying in more stuff from abroad, which isn't genetically suited to this country, compared with what we could grow from what is obviously older. Now we can argue where that originally came from. Maybe it wasn't even Irish.
Before you get into arguing about hawthorn prevalence, we might dive on.
But the main point is, you shouldn't have bothered. The main point is that we want to keep these old hedges, and what we intend to do there is broaden. You see, we have managed to keep the setback there around that one. We didn't manage to keep it so well on these ones, and the reason for that was there is a rule under the afforestation scheme where the maximum open area within your new afforestation is that you will be paid on is 15%. So if I went beyond 15% of open non-planted area, I would be reducing my payments, and the payments are important.
Can I ask you a question, James?
No,
What setback from a hedge do you think we should have?
20 metres.
Jesus.
Wow. What sort of forest will you have?
Step 20 metres there.
Well, that's 7 metres, let's say. So it's probably 3 times that length.
You need room for those trees.
And all the wildflowers and scrubland that comes in here.
What height is it Norway spruce at Clearfell?
30 metres.
So the shade, that's 30 metres up.
So if you had a
And the shade
site
from that
that's
is
crisscrossed by loads and loads of hedges, you want 20 metre setbacks from all them.
Because if
Then
you're
you
trying,
want forestry.
I do want forestry, I want mixed forestry, and I want the biodiversity that goes with it. But if you look at this here,
Oh God, he's on his feet.
if you look at this here, those trees are only my height. Those new Norway spruce are only my height now. You were saying they're going to be 30 metres tall when they get high. Even with that setback that's on that now, that hedge is going to be lost when those trees come to maturity. Now, if we keep a continuous cover management in place indefinitely, there will always be 30 metre high trees on site. They will always be shading that.
But if they're hard ones, if we don't.
But they're not here, we have conifers.
But if they weren't.
Well, if they weren't, it's a different. It's slightly different.
About establishing new
But the
forests.
problem is the conifer plantations are doing this more than the broadleaf plantations, mostly because there's more conifer. And the conifer has its 100% use, it's a commercial crop. But if we lose these, we lose everything that goes with them. And in order to maintain those, now that's a north-south running hedge there. It has a slight advantage over this one, which is running east-west. Simply because when the sun rises in the east and tracks across, that side of the hedge will get a certain amount of sun early in the day, and that side will get a certain amount late in the day. But if we do not leave room around them, you're going to lose them. And if we had a shot of where further down the esker, where the bigger trees, where they're not even the biggest ones on that side. You know the ones we stood on top of the esker meadow and we looked at.
I think if nothing else, what this shows is that there's so much nuance.
Yeah.
Now, this
that's mine.
will reintroduce Olive Levy. Olive, you have a very different path to forestry than James.
Very different
Yeah.
and a very different knowledge and understanding.
I don't know about that.
Different. I wouldn't say it's like
Yeah.
So I grew up in a dairy farm in Westmeath, and I think like all children of dairy farmers, they were out involved in calving and all that. But then my parents very much pushed for all of us to go to college, so I went off and did got my degree. And around that same time, Mum and Dad was beginning to wind down, and they made the decision to plant forest on an out farm that we had a couple of kilometres from the main dairy farm. And I didn't even know it happened. I was too busy studying, having a good time in university. And every so often I'd hear Dad talk about, I need to go up to the forest, do some work, and I never went, never saw it. And I did a PhD in immunology with Kingston Mills and Luke O'Neill in Trinity. And then I went off to London and I worked as an editor with Nature, one of the big science magazines there. I ran one of the journals for 11 years and still never stepped foot in our own forest, knew nothing about it. And for various reasons I made the decision to move home. Initially actually to open a cafe in Lahinch, that was the dream.
Not too late.
With my sister. with my sister, and as we were driving down when I was home to look at a premises, she told me she was expecting her first child. So that was that a day out the window. Thank God, because with COVID and everything, it would have been a disaster. But so then I was like, well, what am I going to do? And Dad was like, oh, I need some help with, we need to put in a road, get a felon license and all this in the forest. And I was like, okay, right, I can give you a hand with the paperwork. So I went up to the woods for the first time, and for various reasons, Dad hadn't been up there for several years. He had taken very good care of the place and done a huge amount of pruning and all that when it was planted. But it had got very overgrown and all the access paths had grown over. So we just started kind of opening it up, kind of get a bit of access, start doing the paperwork, and just the more I spent in it, the more I fell in love with the place. And we kind of needed to thin some of the hardwoods, so I said, sure, I'll get a chainsaw. Never lifted a chainsaw in my life.
When I was looking for you, a profile picture for you, I found this one, I don't know who took it, it's Alan with the big chainsaw.
That was the Irish independence story, yeah. And yeah, never looked back. I've set up a firewood business since then, from the thinnings coming out of the hardwoods. Well, I met James. That was also a big reason as to why I took up a chainsaw. He very much encouraged me. He's been very much of a mentor. We don't always see eye to eye, but he's given me a huge amount of encouragement. I think without him and the producer groups, actually,
I think it was more than me now.
Well, you were seeing it, but the producer group network actually for me was a huge, support network, because there's not many women kind of managing woods. Well, no, there's a few. I take that back. There are a few. There's more coming on stream.
Not doing the chainsaw.
There's not that many actually working in it. So, and like I've no machinery. I still don't really have much machinery. But anyway, this is the woods. So we've got 2/3 of it's Norway spruce, then sycamore, good lot of sycamore, ash, a little bit of beech, a little bit of birch. Oh yeah, Manus is my forester as well, so he knows it quite well. And we just did our first thinning. So I've been thinning the hardwoods for that, going in, taking out some sycamore and ash. We've got dieback, which is heartbreaking.
That's that back block there, Olive, is it?
Yeah.
You can see the trees which haven't come into leaf up the
No,
back.
sorry, yeah, that's mainly sycamore. It's just that corner there is ash,
okay,
and it's all the
gotcha.
stuff at the front. You see
Yes,
all
yeah,
that
yeah.
spindly stuff.
Yeah.
And along the edge there. I know, it's about 1.5 hectares of ash. So that'll have to come out in the next year probably. And now I had a great idea of let's put in native woodland, won't that be lovely? And about 4 weeks ago I said I should plant, Manus had a few trees left over, a few oak, planted them, and sure the deer have got them already. So I went out there last during the week, and over half of them have been pulled up and the head's gone. So I don't know how, we'll have to think about what we're going to do. Well, yeah. I mean, it's, people laugh, but we have to do something with deer management in this country.
You manage the woods under a particular system, Olive?
Oh yeah, CCF as well, yeah. So kind of the reason I did that was when I started, I knew nothing about forestry, and I started reading, and it was all about you grow for 30, your crop for 35 years, and you come in then and clear fell and replant, and I was kind of doing the maths going, Jesus, I'd be very young now getting that amount of money. What am I going to do for the rest of my life? Because it didn't add up. I would still, if I had to follow that model, I'd just be in my early 60s, and that's my entire income gone, because I want to try and make an income out of my woods. That's my goal. Can I live from these woods? And then I started looking around. Now I had a couple of foresters that were in, and they were like, what are you on about, CCF? That's the most ridiculous kind of thing, like cutting out your best trees and leaving your weaker trees to be your seed cotton, like just completely not understanding what CCF is. And then I kind of got to know Manus, and went through James as well, and with Pro Silva Ireland, got good understanding of CCF. So that's the way we're managing it. So the kind of goal now is to introduce more diversity. The Norway spruce isn't doing great in some patches. This patch here, you can kind of see there's a good bit of yellowing in some of the trees. So we're putting in, we've put in Western Red Cedar in to try and stabilise that section, because it's probably we'll get a bit of wind blowing there as well. It's quite unstable. and then diversity, and then just open it up for. So hopefully by the time I hand it on to the next generation, we'll have natural regeneration going. But I think now for the next several decades, we're going to have to do interventions to actually bring in the diversity in there, stabilise the site, and allow it then so that we've got a big diverse woodland. So that's kind of the aim.
Could you just explain briefly all of CCF?
Now, come on, you're the CCF expert and practitioner.
We're under time pressure here.
Okay, mine's very, very simple.
Might as well let Crowley do it because he only correct us.
My very, I suppose, simple and rudimentary understanding of it is that you allow your woodland, or it's based on natural regeneration. So the way I understand it is that you remove the trees that have reached their potential to allow other trees to reach theirs. You know, that's kind of just the way when someone explains to me like that, I'm like, I understand it that way. So
you're every couple of years you're taking out a percentage of trees from the forest,
exactly.
But the canopy always stays in place.
Canopy always stays, and it makes financial sense because the trees you're taking out are predominantly going to be saw logs. So you're taking out a lower proportion, but they're better trees. So financially, you're getting the good returns on it. And it's just then allowing kind of the smaller trees that probably would have got whipped out because they're smaller trees, but they've got, good shape and all that, and giving them the opportunity then to grow for the next, rotations further down the line. So it has to be economically viable. I need to be able to live off it, to be able to invest my time and energy into developing it and developing the biodiversity areas, and like I'm doing a lot of animal tracking in it at the moment, seeing what's in there. I've got a couple of wildlife cameras and I'm just being in the place. Like
you spend a lot of your time.
I know, every time you phone me, like you in the woods.
You touched on some barriers. Maybe you might cover some, Manus, and one of them that you brought up, Olive, and it mightn't be a barrier that everyone would acknowledge or see as a real problem to diverse farm forestry is actually deer. Do you want to explain that, Manus, what's kind of going on, or what direction it forces foresters to go?
Yeah. So I don't know if you're aware, but like we have a huge deer problem in Ireland. I don't know what the numbers are. Sika deer and fallow deer are the two non-native invasive species of deer that we have. We also have red deer. I live in Kilkenny and we have red deer in Kilkenny, and they're not native red deer, but you meet them every so often in a woodland, and they're about the size of a cow. They're massive creatures. So the deer were introduced. There was deer farms in Ireland. It's not the 70s or the 80s. Maybe there was deer farms. And 70s. Yeah, it was a mad scheme that never materialised and it didn't turn into what they thought. People just opened the gates and released the deer into the wild. People probably think deer are beautiful animals. I mean, they are. They taste lovely. But the problems we have, the types of forests that people want. Everybody in this room, I'm sure, wants diverse forests, native woodland, mixed woodland, CCF managed forests. With the levels of deer that we have at the moment, that is practically impossible to do. Without concerted shooting and controlled and coordinated management of the deer, there is no way we're going to be able to achieve the diversity in our forests that we want. There's absolutely no way it's going to happen. The only way I can do that as a forester is by putting up deer fences. It seems a crazy way of doing it. I have a lovely site in Lara, County Wicklow, native woodland site. Spent probably €12,000 on putting up a deer fence around that site. And the deer are still getting in. They're an amazing animal. They can easily jump 8 feet. Easily, well, definitely 6 or 7 feet, easy.
All we're going to do is fence in the deer into the woods.
Yeah.
Do you know, like if everyone starts putting up deer fence, we're just going to just fence the deer into the woods.
Lads, I really have to wrap it up. It's good that we're still wanting to talk at the end of it. I thought it was a great panel, so I'll give him a bowl of boss. Yeah.